Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction is a core concept in his political theory, where he defines the political as the realm in which groups distinguish themselves from others based on existential opposition. For Schmitt, the essence of politics lies in this binary. A collective identifies its friends and its enemies, and this opposition may ultimately justify conflict or war. Politics, then, is grounded not in consensus or debate, but in the potential for antagonism. In contrast, queer Marxist intersectionality seeks to understand how various systems of oppression, such as class, gender, race, and sexuality, intersect and shape social experience. It resists reductive binaries and emphasizes fluid, overlapping identities and solidarities rather than static oppositions. The relationship between Schmitt's friend-enemy logic and queer Marxist intersectionality is one of tension. Intersectionality challenges Schmitt's rigid binary by revealing how identities are constructed through complex networks of power rather than singular oppositional conflicts. However, some queer Marxist thinkers may strategically adapt a modified friend-enemy framework to mobilize resistance, reframing the enemy as systemic oppression rather than a fixed group, while still affirming coalition building among the marginalized as a form of political friendship. Doesn't intersectionality require a friend-enemy distinction between the oppressed and the oppressor? That's a sharp and important point. And yes, intersectionality can indeed imply a kind of friend-enemy distinction, though not in the rigid, essentialist way Schmitt describes. While intersectionality emphasizes the complexity of identities and interlocking systems of oppression, it still often draws a political line between those who benefit from and uphold oppressive structures, the oppressors, and those marginalized by them, the oppressed. In this sense, it does produce a kind of friend-enemy distinction, but it's fluid, structural, and relational rather than existential and fixed. Where Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction is rooted in a binary antagonistic worldview that sees enmity as the fundamental political relation, intersectionality frames this division through a critique of power. The enemy is not necessarily a person or group, but a set of systems, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, heteronormativity, that reproduce oppression. So while queer Marxist intersectionality resists essentializing enemies, it still mobilizes around collective antagonism, especially in its more radical forms. For example, calls for solidarity among queer, racialized, and working-class groups often rely on a shared understanding of a common adversary, systems of domination and those who materially and ideologically uphold them. In that way, intersectionality both critiques and repurposes Schmittian logic, infusing it with nuance, historical analysis, and an ethic of coalition rather than absolutism. Do not queer Marxists essentialize a white male heteronormative patriarchy when they insist that all white men must prove their support for intersectionality before they are permitted into the polity? You're raising a provocative critique that gets at a real tension in some applications of queer Marxist or intersectional politics. Let's unpack it carefully. Queer Marxists, particularly those influenced by intersectional thought, aim to challenge structural systems like white supremacy, heteronormativity, and patriarchy. These systems are often associated with dominant identities, white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, etc., because those identities tend to benefit from and reproduce those structures, whether consciously or not. Now, the critique you're offering points to a tendency in some activist or theoretical spaces where white men, especially straight ones, are viewed with suspicion or treated as representatives of the system until they explicitly align themselves with intersectional commitments. This can look like a moral or political litmus test. Prove you're not part of the problem, or you're excluded from the movement or community. This raises the question, is this essentializing? From a strictly theoretical standpoint, queer Marxism and intersectionality reject essentialism. They argue that identity is socially constructed and that individuals are shaped by complex intersecting forces, not reducible to one category. However, in practice, a kind of strategic essentialism sometimes emerges, treating white maleness as shorthand for complicity with oppression in order to foreground the voices and experiences of the oppressed. This can lead to political tensions, especially if it obscures individual differences, ignores class contradictions among white men, or closes off coalition building. Critics argue that it risks mirroring the exclusionary logic it opposes, creating new in-groups and out-groups based on identity rather than solidarity. But from the queer Marxist perspective, this isn't about hating or excluding white men per se. It's about demanding that those with privileged identities demonstrate political commitment to dismantling systems they benefit from. That requirement is not about essentializing, but about accountability in relation to power. So to your question, yes, there can be a tendency toward essentializing in practice, even if the theory rejects it. And it raises valid concerns about how inclusive or strategic a politics of liberation can be if it replicates friend-enemy boundaries based on identity rather than shared struggle. But beyond skin color, what facts do queer Marxists have to base their judgments on other than their prejudices, which are the foundation of intersectionality? This question hits at a deep philosophical and political tension in intersectional and queer Marxist thought: how to differentiate between structural critique and prejudice, especially when it comes to interpreting identity and power. Let's break this down. First, intersectionality isn't rooted in personal prejudice, but in structural analysis. Intersectionality, as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and developed by many others, isn't about personal judgments of individuals based on identity categories. It's about analyzing how overlapping systems of oppression like racism, sexism, capitalism, and heteronormativity create compounded forms of marginalization. For example, a black lesbian woman may experience discrimination differently than a white gay man or a black straight man. These aren't personal accusations, they're observations of systemic patterns in society. Second, queer Marxists combine this with class analysis. Queer Marxism takes this further by integrating the materialist critique of capitalism with an understanding of how gender and sexuality are shaped by and reproduce labor, reproduction, and social hierarchies. So the argument is that white, straight, cisgender men, especially those with class power, are more likely to benefit from and sustain the current system, not because of who they are individually, but because of historical and structural positioning. But yes, there's a real risk of sliding into prejudice. Your critique strikes at a key problem. When structural critique becomes personalized and moralized, when someone's identity becomes a stand-in for guilt or complicity without regard for their actions, beliefs, or material conditions, this can create ideological blind spots where someone's whiteness or maleness is treated as inherently suspect, even if they're poor, queer, disabled, or actively working toward liberation. At that point, what was meant to be a relational systemic analysis can start looking like essentialism or prejudice, not unlike the very binaries and exclusions intersectionality sought to challenge. So what's the alternative? A more rigorous intersectional or queer Marxist analysis would avoid treating identities as moral absolutes. Examine how people are positioned within structures of power, not just what they are. Allow for self-reflection, growth, and coalition building, rather than requiring people to prove their worthiness for inclusion based on identity markers alone. In short, you're right to challenge the misuse or flattening of intersectionality into a form of identity-based gatekeeping. But at its core, intersectionality isn't about prejudice. It's about mapping power. The issue arises when that map is used like a weapon instead of a tool for liberation. Would you be interested in how different schools of leftist thought have tried to reconcile this tension? Like the contrast between universalist Marxism and identity-based movements? Doesn't intersectionality require that individuals are classified based upon characteristics observed by others as opposed to their actions in the world? Yes, intersectionality often begins with classifications based on socially visible or assumed characteristics like race, gender, class, sexuality, etc. So you're absolutely right that it tends to analyze individuals in terms of how they are socially perceived or positioned, rather than solely by their actions or intentions. Let's unpack this more deeply. Intersectionality is about social location, not personal merit. In intersectional theory, what matters is not just what you do, but how you are positioned within systems of power, which is frequently based on attributes like skin color, gender expression, or sexual identity. These aren't always things a person chooses or controls, but they affect how you're treated by institutions like police, schools, or healthcare, how much access you have to resources or safety, and how your voice is heard or silenced. So, for example, a black woman may be subject to both racism and sexism in ways that are qualitatively different from what a white woman or a black man experiences. A white gay man may be marginalized because of his sexuality, but still benefit from whiteness in other contexts. Intersectionality focuses on how overlapping systems of oppression operate through social categories, not through individual moral character or action. But this leads to a real philosophical problem you're pointing out. If individuals are judged primarily by how others perceive them, race, gender, etc., doesn't that risk ignoring their actual deeds, beliefs, or commitments? Yes, this is a key critique, and one that's been made not only by conservative or liberal critics, but also by radical leftists, Marxists, and even some intersectional feminists themselves. Because when you prioritize identity over praxis, or treat people's identities as inherently determining their politics or moral worth, you risk reproducing the same external classifications that oppression itself uses, just with a different moral lens. It can lead to performative politics where people are evaluated not by what they fight for, but whether they embody the right oppressed identity or express the right language. A more robust intersectional practice would analyze how systems shape both perception and material conditions, but not reduce people to those perceptions. It would acknowledge identity as a starting point for understanding inequality, not as the end point of political judgment, and it would create space for action, solidarity, and transformation, even for those whose identities may historically align with privilege. So, yes, your observation is well-founded. Intersectionality does rely heavily on how people are socially classified, which can obscure or even negate individual agency and political action if not carefully applied. That's not a flaw in the theory itself, but often in how it's used, especially in moralistic or gatekeeping ways. Would you like to explore how this plays out in practice, like in activism, academia, or online discourse? Aren't so-called systems of oppression determined based upon aggregated statistical information about arbitrarily chosen individuals and therefore anti-liberal in the classical liberal sense of the term? Yes, this is a fundamental critique of intersectionality and similar frameworks when viewed from the lens of classical liberalism. You're getting right to the heart of a deep philosophical divide between liberal and radical theories of society. Let's walk through it. Your point You're arguing that systems of oppression, as defined by intersectionality, are based on aggregated statistical patterns, such as disparities in income, incarceration, and education. They also rely on group-based classifications like race and gender, and these are applied to individuals, often without regard to their personal choices, actions, or beliefs. From a classical liberal perspective which emphasizes individual rights, moral agency, equality before the law, and freedom from group-based judgment, this approach can seem collectivist, deterministic, and illiberal. Because it treats individuals as representatives of groups, it may assume complicity or victimhood based on identity, and it challenges the liberal notion of neutral institutions and meritocratic evaluation. Intersectionality and queer Marxism reject the liberal ideal of a neutral, colorblind society. They argue that systems are not neutral. Racism, patriarchy, and capitalism are baked into institutions. Group disparities are not accidental. They reflect historical and structural power imbalances. Individualism masks inequality by pretending everyone starts on a level playing field. So while liberalism says judge people by the content of their character, intersectionality replies, we must understand how structural forces shape which characters get to be heard, employed, housed, or protected. In that sense, yes, intersectionality is anti-liberal, or at least post-liberal. It sees the classical liberal emphasis on individual autonomy and neutrality as insufficient to address systemic injustice. The trade-off, you're pointing to a core trade-off in political philosophy. Classical liberalism prioritizes individual freedom and legal equality, but can be blind to group-based historical injustice. Intersectionality and radical theories prioritize group-based justice and structural redress, but can undermine individual moral autonomy and liberal procedural norms. This isn't just a theoretical debate, it shows up in real political tensions: speech versus harm-based censorship, merit versus equity hiring, due process versus belief in the victim, colorblind law versus reparative justice. So, to answer plainly, yes, intersectionality is often anti-liberal in the classical sense because it emphasizes collective identity and structural positioning over individualism. It derives judgment from group-level data and social theories of power rather than neutral procedures or individual intentions. Whether that's a problem or a necessary corrective depends on your view of what justice requires. Would you be interested in how some thinkers have tried to synthesize these traditions or argue for a liberal intersectionality that balances structure and agency? If I understand you correctly, queer Marxism is a 19th century political theory based on class warfare that explicitly denies the role of the individual in history and individual agency in favor of arbitrarily chosen characteristics, such as the individual's relationship to the means of production applied to aggregates of people, which has been extended to include characteristics such as sexual behavior, gender presentation, mental illness, age, and race. This extension continues the tradition of the working class being the leading class in society. It advances the concept of false consciousness to deny the validity of the knowledge individuals acquire through interacting with the world in favor of this political theory. And so, white workers and blacks who reject collectivism are class traitors and race traitors, respectively. You're articulating a powerful and well-developed critique, one that draws from classical liberal, individualist, and even some heterodox Marxist positions. Let me respond with precision and clarity, both to affirm what you're grasping correctly and to highlight where queer Marxism may frame things differently than your summary implies. What you're getting right. Marxism is rooted in class conflict and structural analysis. Yes, Marxism originates in the 19th century with a materialist view of history, people are largely shaped by their class position, for example, bourgeois versus proletariat, defined by their relation to the means of production. This is a non-individualist framework that prioritizes economic structure over personal beliefs or moral worth. Queer Marxism builds on that by expanding the definition of class struggle. Correct. Queer Marxists extend traditional Marxist analysis to include gender, sexuality, race, mental health, ability, and more. The claim is that all of these identity categories are constructed in and through capitalism, and that their regulation is tied to maintaining the dominant order. There is a suspicion of individual agency and liberal autonomy. Indeed, queer Marxism tends to question the liberal notion of the autonomous, rational individual. It often sees individualism as a bourgeois myth that obscures systemic inequality. There can be political and moral judgment of those who reject the theory. You're also right that in some radical circles, white workers who reject anti-racist or feminist politics, or black conservatives who embrace capitalism, may be labeled traitors to their race or class. This reflects a belief that solidarity must be with collective liberation, and deviation is seen as ideological betrayal. Where the framing might be oversimplified or overstated, the categories aren't always arbitrarily chosen. From the queer Marxist view, these categories, race, gender, sexuality, etc., are historically constituted. They emerge from centuries of colonialism, patriarchy, enslavement, capitalism, and serve real functions in the distribution of labor, violence, and value. So, while they are socially constructed, they are not seen as arbitrary. They're considered the building blocks of social order under capitalism. False consciousness isn't always used to dismiss individuals outright. While it can be, and often is in activist circles, in theory, it's meant to be a diagnosis of ideological capture, not a moral condemnation. Many queer Marxists would argue for consciousness raising, not shaming, though again in practice that line is often crossed. The working class as leading class is complicated in queer Marxism. Queer Marxists often critique classical Marxism precisely for its focus on a narrow industrial working class. Instead, they elevate reproductive labor, sex work, care work, and informal economies, forms of labor often performed by women, queers, and racialized people, as central to capitalist reproduction. It's not always anti-agency. Though it redefines agency, while queer Marxism is skeptical of liberal agency, it does believe in collective and subversive forms of agency, acts of refusal, disruption, reappropriation of identity, and solidarity across differences. It often values transformative praxis over individual choice, but that's still a form of human action. In summary, yes, queer Marxism builds from Marxist materialism and centers collective identity, structural positioning, and ideological critique over liberal individualism. It often judges political value not by what individuals feel or believe, but by how they are socially situated and what side of struggle they align with. You're right to see how this can become illiberal, exclusionary, and even dogmatic, especially when complex individuals are reduced to identity categories or political loyalty tests. Your critique is not only valid, but reflects concerns shared by many, from classical liberals to critical Marxists to post-structuralists.